Thank you everyone for joining. This is the 22nd episode of the Hunger for Justice broadcast, Unlearning Agriculture with Chris Newman and Raj Patel. This episode is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube for future viewing. Welcome to everyone in the Zoom room. We also welcome everyone in the live broadcasts on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. We will be populating the Zoom chat with links to follow today's speakers. We also encourage audience questions, so please submit your questions in the Q&A in the Zoom or the chat in the live stream. Again, this is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube. A Growing Culture is a nonprofit organization advancing a culture of farmer autonomy and agroecological innovation. And now to introduce the program is Lauren Cardelli of A Growing Culture.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. This episode doesn't need much introduction. Raj Patel and Chris Newman are some of the best speakers, minds, actions, doers, activists on the planet. And it is an honor to have them both here in dialogue with us on the Hunger for Justice broadcast. Today's topic is unlearning agriculture, and there's a lot to do. And the first thing that involves is shutting up and listening. So I'm gonna start that off right now and kick it over to these amazing folk. Thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you, Lauren and Julia and everyone at A Growing Culture. My name's Raj Patel, and it's my great pleasure today to be introducing Chris Newman, a man from whom I've learned a great deal and whose voice couldn't be more relevant today. So Chris is an enrolled member of the Chapter band of the Piscataway Indians. He's a former software engineer, and he started farming when his wife insisted that he abandon his tech career following a health scare. So today he sells his pastured eggs, poultry, and meats at farmers markets, retail establishments, and restaurants. And born and raised in the DC area by parents who emphasized education, he studied at exclusive private schools where he became comfortable helping white people feel comfortable around him. He's also a farmer and indigenous food sovereignty advocate in Central Virginia who's out to democratize food and agriculture in the Washington, D.C. region by building a vertically integrated, employee-owned cooperative of farms, nurseries, mills, processors, retail outlets, and wholesale distributors that creates the political pressure necessary to redefine regenerative agriculture. And it's his work in Unlearning Agriculture that we're here to learn about today. If you've got questions, please do use the Q&A facility on Zoom, and I'll harvest those towards the end of our hour together. But without any further ado, let's unlearn some things from you, Chris. So can you walk us through some of your journey to unlearning agriculture?
Yeah, man. And thanks everybody for those introductions. I honestly don't feel like I'm worthy of any of them, but I'll take it. It'll make my mama happy. Not to say it doesn't make me happy. So yeah, unlearning agriculture. Anybody that follows us on social media will hear me refer to the Dunning-Kruger curve over and over and over again. And our journey in agriculture has been that. It's been starting completely from outside of agriculture. I worked in tech, worked in consulting, the knowledge information economy, whatever you want to call it. And to the point now where I'm a full-time farmer and we're doing something completely different than what my wife and I had initially set out to do. So let me just kind of walk you through a little bit of that and just talk about, you know, kind of organically, I guess, what I had to kind of realize about things given where I started. So like you said, it began with a health scare. I used to work as a software engineering tech consultant. I was kind of at the semi-executive level. I was mostly not really writing code. I was mostly managing people's expectations and getting yelled at and being the guy that explained why things didn't break or why people didn't show up. And it was just the worst. Like I love the people I worked with, but the job was just not great. It was for a government client that, you know, it was at least for a civilian agency, but it's the one that nobody likes, you know, the IRS. They're about as happy as you would expect for the most part, being with the IRS. So, you know, it sucked. And I wound up with these like really cancer-like health symptoms that made me think, holy crap, I'm like 28, 29 years old and I think I might die. Holy crap. So after a bunch of medical evaluations and all this other stuff, it turned out that I did not have the various types of cancer that everybody thought I had. It basically had stress that was just manifesting in my gut, and the solutions were like none. It's like, we can medicate you for the rest of your natural life, and here's your bill. So, married men live longer for a reason. My wife said that my tech career was over, and so it was. And we moved to Central Virginia from Washington, D.C., where we were living, and we decided to start a farm. Now, the thing about that is, when we started the farm, we had this idea that everybody tends to have. Farming should be small. Farming should be oriented around families. The big issue with farms is that the government gets in the way, that agribusiness gets in the way. I'm going to apologize. There's a really angry crow that's getting its nest invaded by a hawk. So you're just going to hear that like all day, in a testament that nature like does not care about our
about Zoom calls. Yeah.
Like, don't care about your Zoom call, doesn't care about your tech, doesn't care. Like, nature's going to do what it's going to do. So anyway, we got into it for like all the traditional reasons. We were going to help fix the food system. We were going to grow things organically. We were going to use holistic systems and blah, 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 blah. So this kind of got us almost into lesson one that we needed to unlearn, which is that we got into agriculture thinking it was like a business. And it turns out agriculture is not a business. So coming in from like the information economy, from the tech world, if you're going to start a business as like a tech consultant, you're going to write code, or you're going to start the next Facebook, or especially doing what I do, where it's like billable rates, that kind of thing. What you do is you figure out what your rate is going to be, so it'll cover your salary, your employees' salaries, your overhead, your office, your phone line, your insurance. You build in a profit margin, and then you sell those billable hours for as many of those as you need to in order to make your business work. And the fundamental assumption behind that is that there's enough competition and there's enough demand for those wages and for that rate to be supported without like this giant public welfare system. People tend not, especially people from the outside of agriculture, tend not to understand just how dependent the farming business is on external supports from the federal government. We got into it thinking that as long as we sold our stuff direct to consumer, and as long as we, avoided government regulation by staying small enough and that sort of thing, then we would not have a problem. I want to get away from this crow because this is like actually distracting even me. I think he's actually yelling at me. I think he thinks I'm after something. So yeah, the business of agriculture turned out to be something completely different than what we thought it was. Farming, for the most part, is not about growing corn or growing beef or growing, whatever commodity for X price and then selling it for Y price and hoping that Y minus X equals profit. Farming is really about asset protection and asset appreciation. If you're, and this, I don't want to talk about farming as a monolith because there's lots of different ways to farm, but when we're talking about the type of farming that dominates the majority of acreage, of the actual revenue that comes in from farming, we're talking about people that are farming the big six. We're talking about corn, we're talking about soybeans, cotton, rice, those kind of commodity crops that are the beneficiaries of direct payments, crop insurance, that sort of thing. When it comes to those businesses, if you are a farmer in one of those, your goal is basically to use farming in order to, number one, avoid property taxes, and number two, have a reason to occupy the land that you have. Because there's no reason to have 1,000 acres, 2,000 acres, 3,000 acres if you're not farming it. Like, what's the point? If you are, the seventh generation inheritor of this land, and that's kind of your asset base, then what else would you need it for if you're not going to farm? So everything around how you protect that asset, from inheritance taxes to property taxes to, excuse me, to your ability to, say, mortgage that land and mortgage those assets in order to build a house, start a business, do whatever the heck you want to do with the value that you mortgage. It's all about that. It's not necessarily about making sure that you make a profit from your product. The issue with that is that if you fundamentally don't have to care about your market, if you don't have to care about profit, you don't have to care about your market. If you don't have to care about your market, you don't have to care about people. If you don't have to care about people, you don't really have to care about anything. This is how we wind up with kind of a quote unquote food system that's based on these cheap commodities that agribusiness then takes and turns into, you know, tens of thousands of SKUs that are kind of the same thing, just turned into, you know, 9 different kinds of Lucky Charms and Fruit Loops or whatever.
Chris, sorry, can I just interrupt to make sure I've got this right? So what you're saying is that what you discovered, what you had to unlearn about farming was not that it's, you know, a job that you can get like any other, and you find some land and then you chew on a straw and look which way the wind is blowing and look at the markets and then decide, oh yeah, I'm going to grow this because people want that. It's much more a system of power that lets whoever's occupying the land stay on the land for as long as humanly possible. And if they've stolen the land, they would encourage people to forget that. And the government is there to make sure that amnesia is baked into the soil. Is that right?
Yeah, and amnesia is actually a really good way to put it. Because what we hear from farm marketing is that instead of hearing that farmers are, you know, almost millionaires, which most of them are, like I think the average net worth, according to the Economic Research Service with the USDA, is something like the average farmer's net worth is closing in on $1 million. It's something like $850,000, $900,000, something like that. Most of these guys are millionaires on paper. Some of them are a little bit cash poor, but that's how wealth operates. Like even like, I don't know, Steve Jobs before he died, or Jeff Bezos or whatever, they don't have like a Scrooge McDuck money belt where they're just like swimming in cash. Like, it's illiquid for a reason, because illiquid cash can't be taxed. Like, that's the point. But yeah, there's this idea that farmers are poor and like they're kind of the last redoubt of American grit and hard work and like blue collar go get itness kind of and that kind of thing. And there's this idea that they're under siege, and you'll hear about this in media a lot, with a couple of statistics that are put out there all the time. Two in particular. One is farm debt. They'll always talk about farm debt is $400 billion. Like, holy crap. And the other one is half of farms, I think it's something like half of farms out of like 2 million or so farming outfits, half of them have negative net income. That seems really bad. And those are the two statistics that most farming organizations make sure get out there. The problem is they don't look at the other side of that. And this is not something that's like a conspiracy or that's hidden by like the USDA or anything. Like the rest of this data I'm about to share with you is right there on their website. Farm debt is $400-something billion. Farm assets are over 3 trillion. So their assets to debt ratio is over 8 to 1. And the question is, what does that mean? If you look at some of the most profitable and successful corporations on the planet, like let's look at Apple or Exxon, it usually doesn't get beyond 2 to 1. Farms have some of the healthiest balance sheets. I mean, just out of control, healthy balance sheets you could possibly imagine. That's how you have even like, you know, Joe and Jane, average farmer, having a net worth of almost $1 million. Like these guys have an incredible amount of assets at their disposal. Beyond that, because of the way most farming operates, the way like grain outfits or things like that work, it's not that much work, for example, because it's so mechanized. Most farmers, if you meet farmers, like I've met some of the guys that are in my area that farm, they do kind of a combination of wheat, soy, corn, sometimes canola. They don't do anything most of the time farming related. These guys have full-time jobs off the farm, working as cops, teachers, firefighters. Some of them don't do anything. They got a spouse that works in town or works in DC or something. It's the kind of job where you can work, I don't know, like a few days a quarter, usually fixing combines, doing maintenance on equipment and things like that. And then the rest of the time you're on a tractor on auto steer, just doing your harvest or doing your spraying, your planting or whatever. Like so much of this computerized and mechanized, it's not really a full-time job. So what happens is if you look at the USDA statistics, average farmers' income, their actual income that they make, not necessarily from the farm, but from other jobs, is significantly higher than the national median. They have higher incomes and they have higher net worth. But we're being convinced all the time that these guys are under siege by the government, by agribusiness, even though the government and agribusiness are exactly why they are wealthy in the first place. It's an incredibly sophisticated and successful con that's really gone on for a really long time. and has kind of caused, when you've got people that are trying to come into agriculture from new spaces, people that aren't involved in the space, you come in thinking that the problem is government agribusiness. So what do you do to avoid regulation? What do you do to avoid agribusiness? And these are the things that my wife and I did. We followed the whole Joel Salatin kind of model of, we're going to avoid this by going direct to consumer. So we're going to go around agribusiness. We're not going to take like commodity gate prices. We're going to go straight to their gullets. And we're going to stay small so that we stay under the radar of regulation. We're going to stay small. We're not going to integrate. We're not going to participate in the like beyond the farm gate part of the food system where, the FDA tends to get involved, and, the USDA, Food and Nutrition Service tends to get involved. Like, stay away from that by not integrating. And there's this idea that is the pure form of agriculture, where if we were to all just do that and go back to like the roots of agriculture and get government out of the way and get agribusiness out of the way, then everything will be fine. And that's the assumption that Annie and I had when we went into it, that would be enough. And it turned out it wasn't enough. We got in there, and, with all the other assumptions that kind of come with it, like the whole farming around the idea of a nuclear family being one of them. It was just impossible to make the numbers work. And one of the most, I think, poignant conversations I had was with Sarah Mock, who's an agriculture journalist who works with us now. She just hit the nail on the head when I just had a conversation with her in the car, and she just said, look, the price that people are willing to pay for food is not going to pay for living wages and for a living at all. Like, not in the traditional sense that you grow X number of revenue, you have X number of expenses, and you live on the profit, and you're able to sustain your business through the profit, because agriculture is based on assets, and profit isn't really necessary. And those farms, that half of farms that are losing money every year, they just take those losses and offset their off-farm income with it and wind up paying no taxes again. So like, even when they lose, they win, because fundamentally agriculture is not a business. So when you go into it and you're a brand new farmer, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and you're going to go into this thing and you're going to do it right, direct market, stay small, et cetera, you run into a wall. You're just not able to make it work. And beyond the business part, and again, and I'll kind of dive into this, is the small family farming part and the idea of farming small, which I'll kind of go after next. But I wanted to just stop for 1 second and see if there were any questions you've seen, Raj, or anything that you wanted to ask me or that you've seen from the audience.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's lots of questions coming in. Please do keep them coming. There are two kinds of questions here. One is where everyone seems to have a consensus that yes, agribusiness is bad, and hopefully you're just about to launch into, well, what sort of business could be better? And the other kinds of questions we're hearing is, all right, government is stacked against sustainable farming. What sorts of government policies do you imagine might be better suited to sustainable agriculture? And then on top of all of that, I guess I've just got not a concern, but just wanted to flag that there is class differentiation even within farmers. So I certainly know that the farmers who are not quite Scrooge McDuck, but who use the farm to absolutely zero out their taxes through creative accounting, and they're barely on the farm. They hire someone to do the labor. They hire someone to fly, to crop spray. They hire some. There are those kinds of farmers, and then there are the sort of struggling other kind who are looking for the other model, and where and are struggling, because the bank owns the land, Tyson owns the facility. Oh no, actually they own the facility, and then the bank owns that, but Tyson owns the chickens. And the way that a balance sheet might look changes when you see who it is that holds the debt and who it is that holds the assets and who it is that holds the liabilities. But all of that's just as a sort of footnote to your broader point about these ideas of asset management. So maybe the two kinds of questions that are being lobbed at you are: talk to us a bit more about what better government would look like, and talk to us a bit more about what better business might look like, or a better structure of business might look like.
Sure, yeah. I want to tick a lot of people off by basically saying the government isn't really in the way. I've found that to be kind of a line that gets fed. I don't know, when I hear a lot of farmers talking about they don't like government regulations. They don't like, for example, if they wanted to stand up like a small meat processing facility, they don't want to have to go through getting a HACCP and getting certified by the USDA. And if they want to make like value-added products down the end of the chain, they don't want to deal with FDA certification and things like that. I'm strongly of the opinion that those things exist for a reason. There are certainly some cases where regulation gets ridiculous and it gets onerous, but by and large, me being somebody that's like gone through line by line, for example, some of the codes for setting up a federally inspected dairy or federally inspected meat product or processing plant, or even non-government regulation stuff like third-party certifications around like produce and the kinds of things that I've been talking to Sarah Tabor about, who's another huge voice I think everybody should be listening to if they're not already. These things are about basic food safety at scale. There's a lot of this idea that government should get out of the way and people should just trust the farmer to get it right, especially when it comes to food safety type stuff. And it's just not true. And it's not because farmers are necessarily evil or they're going to cut corners or they're bad people. It's that if you're processing 100,000 chickens, you're not going to be able to get eyes on every single one by yourself. You're going to be moving at a speed and at a clip that's going to make it just impossible to do it right, even if you want to. So you want that third party inspector there. You want somebody who doesn't have like a vested interest in your business and like getting every single chicken through the line and maximizing your profitability, because that just doesn't scale well to feeding lots and lots of people. And honestly, I mean, again, just having read the regs, like they're not fun to comply with. Like it's not fun to like hire a consultant and pay him 20 grand to put together a HACCP plan or whatever, but there are harder things to do than that. It's not the end of the world to comply with a lot of those regulations. And frankly, I have not found the government to be in my way at all yet, except when it comes to things like fundraising. Like for example, there's kind of the famous thing where we've been raising money to capitalize our farm profitably because we don't have like a 500-acre farm that we inherited that we can just leverage like $1 million out of to capitalize our business. Like we had to do it another way. We wound up raising money and we suddenly found out that, oh crap, this actually has to be registered with the SEC, even though it's just loans. That was scary. It was a pain in the butt, but even that wasn't that bad. That was finding some attorneys who were willing to help us do the work and like file some fairly simple paperwork, and then that was that. So I don't know if it's because I'm black and I don't expect to get my way, but it's like when things come up, I'm like, oh well, that was a pain in the ass, but so is everything else. So what?
But I guess the kind of government that folk are concerned about more are the kind of USDA funding that returns to scale in ways that reward large farms, which is another way of saying rewarding land theft and rewarding the kinds of inheritance management that happens over generations of land theft in this country. And that kind of government, I think everyone's down with the idea of health and safety and of not having our USDA regulations being watered down even more with, but by the chemicals industry and by the meat industry. And so, a good uplift in terms of health and safety seems like a smart idea. But what about, the structure of the way that the USDA operates so that it systematically sends credit, resources, expertise, and lobbying power towards the large farmers rather than the smaller ones?
Yeah, I mean, we're basically talking about opportunity cost there, right? Because as long as we're funding these guys, we're not funding alternatives. And I think it's hard for me to, I don't know. It's like, I'm kind of one of these guys, like, I don't necessarily want a whole bunch of like money and direct payments and things like that from the government. And that's not to say that, money coming from those farms has to come toward other farms as like direct payments or crop insurance, CRP or whatever. There's lots of other things you could do with that money, including just like giving it, in terms of like land back initiatives and repatriation, rematriation, that sort of thing. I think that's fine. I don't necessarily see it being in the way. There's a difference between it being an opportunity cost and it being in my way as like someone who wants to start a different model of agribusiness. I think it would certainly be a help, for example, if CRP dollars would come back to like native land stewards who otherwise wouldn't be able to get the money.
So can you explain what CRP dollars are for the unenlightened?
Conservation Reserve Program. It's basically, you know, thanks for catching me on that. It's basically paying farmers not to farm, to keep parts of their land, especially in riparian areas and things like that, to keep it out of agricultural production in order to, number one, maintain supply, and number two, ostensibly, to conserve the quality of certain pieces of farmland. And if you talk to like 50 different people about what CRP is for, you're going to get 50 different answers. But that's that's my 1 out of 50, and I'm sure like 9,000 people are going to disagree with me about that. But that's how it strikes me. But yeah, like it would be great if money from programs like that could flow to people who don't have the privileges that I do. Like, you know, in the intro, like I got to go to expensive private schools where I learned to write really well and speak really well and learn how to like make people comfortable with my ideas and sell my ideas. There's a lot of people who are probably better land protectors than I am, but who don't have the opportunities that I do to get my message out there and raise money the way that I have. But in terms of the people right now, who are like trying to get into farming, who are in farming, we tend to be privileged. You know, we might not be like cash rich, but you know, I've got a CS degree. I could quit tomorrow and go back to DC and make a 6-figure salary and be fine. I started farming on my in-laws' land. That was free land. And then the next land we got after that was more free land. And then the land we got after that was like, I don't know, they gave us like 20 acres for like, I don't know, $500 a year. It was like a stupidly small amount of money. People that don't have access to that absolutely need some way to be properly capitalized. And I talked about this at the UN when I did that talk almost a year ago, was that capitalizing farms like ours is going to be one of the biggest, most major issues in terms of getting the kind of model that we're doing to scale and to proliferate and to kind of adjust the way that it needs to operate, you know, the way it might need to in the high plains versus the deep south versus the far west, where everything is on friggin' fire. But yeah, again, it's an opportunity cost. But meanwhile, I think a lot of this talk for me is kind of aimed at people who are on the ground now, and who are trying to, like, you know, maybe you're somebody that started that small family farm. Maybe you're like I was 5 years ago, and you're suddenly realizing that I can't make cash flow. I have to rely on woofers and free labor. I can't pay the kind of wages that attract people who aren't like idiots and entitled. Like, it's like if you're in that situation, you're in a situation where you're going like, what the hell do I do?
Right.
Does God help you if you've got like a partner or you've got a spouse or whatever, and you're trying to work 80 hours a week and you're never sleeping, and maybe you're doing a side hustle to try to make ends meet, like you're going to burn yourself the hell out. And I think a lot of what I'm saying here in terms of like, is the government in the way, are regulations in the way, is kind of devoted towards people in that situation, who are thinking, how do I pivot and kind of get out of this? And is the government in the way, and are regulations in the way, and is agribusiness in the way? And I'll kind of jump off and say this, like, I don't think agribusiness is that bad. Like, I think agribusiness is like one of the few actors that's actually producing something for the market. If you look at what farmers are producing, like they're producing this giant, and again, I'm saying farmers like loosely, you know, there's vegetable farmers and people that are not doing what I'm talking about. Again, we're talking about the big farmers that are occupying all the damn land and all the damn resources. They're producing a giant government subsidized surplus that's like just going out there into the ether, right? And then you've got a bunch of it that's going to livestock feed because it can. You've got a bunch of it that's going to ethanol, biofuels, things like that, industrial applications just because it can. And you've got this teeny tiny amount that's actually going to feed people. And dude, I've actually lost my train of thought. Is about exactly why I started talking about it.
Agribusiness is good, I think, is what you're trying to say.
So agribusiness is grabbing like that last little piece that goes to feed people. And they're actually meeting a need. It's not great, like in terms of ethics. And I'll tell you about like the why black people love McDonald's principle in just a second. But like they're filling a need. Like they're actually taking these products and they're cheap as hell, and they're lobbying for them to be cheap as hell. Like nobody's a bigger cheerleader for farmer welfare than agribusiness, because that's what keeps their commodities cheap. That's what their fairly thin profit margins are based on. And they're actually selling for the market. Like I think in a lot of cases, agribusiness is actually more in tune to what people in communities need than farmers are, because farmers are just growing corn because that's what's going to lower their tax bill. They're growing corn because that's what their combine is already going to harvest. That's what they already know how to do. That's what auto steer is going to let them do. But the business side of it is actually, to an extent, looking at the customer. And the part of that I think sustainable agriculture needs to really understand is that it too needs to be focused on what the customer wants. I've written a lot about this, and I've gotten a lot of shit about this, is a lot of small farming ethic, a lot of sustainable agriculture ethic is all about what customers need to do for farmers. It gets into that whole thing that farmers are these like beat down, downtrodden people who are just trying to do the right thing. And why won't people just pay what food is worth and all this stuff? But, you know, again, we're the ones with a position of privilege. I was the guy that was able to quit my job and like go to the land and do what I want to do for my own health. So like, if we're talking about farming that's going to save the world, we need to go to where customers are at. We need to not be doing things like, and again, ooh, this is such a loaded topic, but like CSAs are something I beat up on all the time because I think they're one of the most market not giving a shit about us kind of vehicles that I've ever seen in my life. Like you got a CSA box where the farmer like puts in like whatever the heck they're saying is in season, and the whole thing is that the consumer needs to share in the risk of the harvest. The consumer needs to understand seasonality and what's available at a certain place and a certain time. The consumer needs to understand the importance of local. The consumer needs to walk hand in hand with the farmer and know their farmer and know what they're going through and blah. It puts all this stuff on the consumer, assuming that that consumer is as wealthy and privileged and has the same safety nets and time and resources as the farmer. And they don't. Like, I grew up with people, whose parents were working like 4, 5 shifts at work. People who like had to decide, are they going to try to run their hot water heater because shit, it might cost too much. Let's maybe boil our bath water on the stove. Like people like that do not have time, like even if they wanted to know their farmer, understand seasonality, eat local, all this stuff. Sustainable agriculture needs to meet people where they're at and do what traditional agribusiness in a nefarious kind of way, but in a fundamentally sustainable kind of way, meet people where they are. Lauren introduced me to a guy in Thailand who's one of the first people who, not one of the first people, but who really articulated this idea with Pun Pun Farms in Thailand about deliberately making food more accessible by like forming a bunch of restaurants with this collective, because people in Bangkok, a lot of them don't have kitchens. They don't have time to cook. They don't have the pots. They don't have the pans. Like street food is like the thing there. And that's the way it is with a lot of poor people. Like going back to the McDonald's principle that I was talking about, why Black people, like where I grew up, love McDonald's, is because McDonald's actually, for the poison that they're putting into communities food-wise, they at least bothered to invest in the hood. You know what I mean? Like a lot of people have love for McDonald's, not because the food is so damn great, because like that's where you would go for air conditioning in the summer. That's where you would go, like if you were walking home from school to warm up and like talk to your homeboys or whatever. Like that was your community center in some cases, where like your community couldn't afford a community center. They had like $1 hamburgers that you could eat because your stomach is rumbling, and when you get home, your parents aren't going to be there. They're both working. They're not going to be able to cook for you. You got to do your homework. You got to like McDonald's is there for you, even though McDonald's is McDonald's. So I think sustainable agriculture, frankly, instead of like constantly giving the finger to agribusiness and to like the McDonald's of the world and all that stuff, needs to look at what they're doing and say, there's some DNA in there that we could use to make ourselves better. You don't want to like poison people, give people cheap crap and like, do that kind of thing. But like we can take the pieces of that says, we're going to use our privilege that we have as farmers who are on the ground right now. And we're going to get into those communities and we're going to do whatever we have to meet them where they're at, and understand that poverty is one of the biggest constraints on our ability to feed people, no matter what kind of agriculture you try to practice.
Well, can I jump in there to see if I can synthesize some of the comments that you're getting in the Q&A and in the chat, which is, I think the idea of where people are at is something that, through histories of redlining in the United States are repercussions of racial capitalism. And insofar as the food is cheap and affordable, McDonald's is a very ambivalent place, right? On the one hand, it's one of the few places of work that's ready to take people who have been formerly incarcerated, for example. And you know, restaurant kitchens are free of discrimination, at least in that dimension, in ways that other places aren't. On the other hand, as one of the commenters noted, one of the reasons that McDonald's burgers are so cheap is through the supply chain they depend on BIPOC workers, exploited labor. And the poverty that we agree is driving this sort of schism between bourgeois sustainable agriculture and the sustainable agriculture that we need for everyone. That poverty is driven by the fact that 7 out of the 10 worst paying jobs in America are in the food system. So, you know, the way that the game is set up is to systematically underpay low-income communities, and what you get is the occasional sort of glimmer of black capitalism's, you know, bourgeoisie through franchised McDonald's. And so the question that comes from all of this is, what's a way of organizing business where exploited labor isn't part of the equation?
Yeah, and I think it's really important, again, because I know I touch on some sensitive things when I say, let's not automatically draw a gun on agribusiness and McDonald's, knowing that there are heavily problematic and deep systemic flaws in the way that they do things. And fundamentally, they are all the way into extractive capitalism, the same kind of thing that you talk about in your book, that you talk about very well. But again, it's a thing where you almost have to be like a little bit of a dark Jedi. Like, you need to be able to look at, like, there's parts of what they're doing that can be emulated, I think, without adopting the parts that are bad. Like, the parts that you want to emulate around agribusiness or around the McDonald's principle are, again, taking your stuff into the communities where they're needed, fitting the needs that people have, like even for convenience food, even for things that aren't necessarily local, like getting people fed like the good, nutritious, organic version of what they're eating, like at a McDonald's, for example. With agribusiness, actually treating your business as something that needs a profit and like tailoring to what consumers actually want. Maybe not like manipulating people's wants by putting high fructose corn syrup in every freaking thing and like making them want like a certain thing by like tapping into their biology and kind of like hacking their systems or whatever. But again, like there's broad strokes of that I think need to be followed. But in terms of your question, like, you know, so how do we reorient systems so that they're not exploitive, so they're not extractive? That's kind of why we've gotten to the point of collective agriculture, employee-owned worker cooperatives for farms, and getting away from this idea that you're going to have a farm oriented around a nuclear family that owns everything and that just hires on help for basically the lowest cost that you can get away with, because that's fundamentally what you wind up doing if you wind up in the wage economy. Mm. I think fundamentally, and I kind of talked about this on a long meandering Twitter thread a while ago, I think ultimately the wage economy itself is the problem. You know, if you're talking about like boiling down everybody's labor and contributions to society in terms of a number that you pay that person per unit of time, I don't think you ever really address the problem. And again, like I've been like heavily influenced by your book, Raj, in the last few days, but it's just really interesting because I've had this thing that I've said that if you look at capitalism versus socialism through indigenous eyes, it really looks like not two fundamentally different systems, but two different ways of distributing the spoils of war against nature. One that says it goes all to the officers, and one that says let's give more of it to the foot soldiers so that they're more willing to participate. So it's like, I don't know how to thread the needle between existing in a wage economy and knowing that in order for agriculture to really work over the long term, I'm sorry, that's like all my farm help, like all the background. But yeah, threading that needle between knowing that, or at least in my heart, thinking that the wage economy is fundamentally what's driving the problem with food and agriculture and access and food sovereignty, and knowing that you have to live in that system practically, I don't have an answer for that. And I think that's the answer that a lot of people are waiting for us to try to answer. And I think some people outside of the United States are starting to answer that question a little better. Again, I'll bring up Joe Jandai again in Thailand. He has an interesting model that might have some longitudinal issues, but his whole idea is getting the price of food down by basically making it so that farmers don't really have to participate in the wage economy. So in his model, anybody that's going to sell into his farming collective is a farmer that grows a diversity of products so that they can feed themselves. They build their own buildings, build their own infrastructure. So they basically have no cost of living. And the idea is that those savings are basically passed into the food itself that makes the food more accessible in terms of price. And from there, like he's got a vertically integrated system where it goes into restaurants, it goes into processors, and it basically gets as close to almost being digested as possible so that people don't have those like extra steps that are necessary and a lot of people don't have access to, again, like kitchens, cookware, that kind of thing. So, I mean, Joe has done a really interesting thing where he's tried to kind of remove at least part of the wage economy from that perspective. Now there's issues of like, what happens when those farmers get older? What happens when they can't farm anymore? What happens when their buildings fall apart? Like where does their capital come from? And some of their capital comes from, fundraising and that kind of thing, but a lot of it goes to the collective. So there's a lot of unanswered questions about that. But I think the bottom line is that for us, where we're starting, and by no means finishing, is again, by getting away from this idea of farm workers versus farm owners, making everybody an owner. So we're basically an employee-owned collective. Everybody shares in the profits. Everybody gets to make decisions about what we grow, when we grow, where we grow, and why, who we distribute to. And the other part for us is vertical integration, so that we can get the full value of the food chain back into our farm. Because right now what happens is, if you start your traditional farm like Annie and I did, and you're going to sell like raw chicken, you're going to sell raw pork, raw eggs, raw produce, you're going to sell kale and tomatoes and all that shit. That's the lowest possible price you can get. Agribusiness makes its money by turning those raw products into something that's either more convenient or something that's just completely different. So they'll take tomatoes, they'll make tomato sauce. They'll take pork and they'll make sausage out of it. They'll take sausage and they'll go a step further and they'll make like frozen dinners with it. They'll freeze their vegetables. They'll freeze their fruits. They'll make popsicles out of stuff. Like they make things that appeal more directly to a more to a more realistic slice of how people consume food. Because not everybody consumes food by like gathering their family around the table, like a big Greek or Italian family or a big like, Indian family, or even like, Mama's Sunday dinner, like in soul food or whatever. Like that's not how most people eat all the time. Like most people eat in a big damn hurry, like on their way to work. They eat in a big damn hurry at lunch, trying to get back to work. They eat in a big damn hurry between shifts. They eat on the bus. They eat in their car. Like they eat where they can, when they can. And anybody who's ever had kids, like my little savages that are like running around this house, like try to make them wait a half an hour for their food. Like try. Like you need meal kits. You need stocks that are ready to go. Like there's ways to feed people healthily. But I don't think we have to choose between like the whole nostalgia, cook everything from scratch all the time, Alice Waters kind of school of thought, and McDonald's. Like I think there's something in the middle that's more nutritious and more convenient.
Well, and I like the idea that you're, busting open these two alternatives and saying, well, look, it doesn't have to be the sort of patriarchal family farm model, and with patriarchs for free, and it doesn't have to be McDonald's either. Many of the questions some of the questions I'm seeing now are, all right, well, what is that cooperative model beyond the farm, right? I mean, get us to where it is that, it's maybe not the meal kit, but something where you can imagine the cooperative building blocks move out that way. And then I have another question about cooperatives, which gets back to where we started. And this question is about assets, because every cooperative that's lasted a while that I know struggles with generational change, right? I mean, I pick your favorite co-op, and if it's been around for 40 years, you'll see the veterans there wondering when they're going to be able to catch in, or how it is that their work for 40 years in building this fantastic thing, building this, the asset of the Rainbow Grocery, for example, in San Francisco, or, pick your favorite co-op. How is that going to matter for them as they hit retirement and they stop being able to work, and who's going to do the care work now that they've done the paid labor work into this asset. And so, this is a question not just that confronts cooperatives, but since the cooperative is your solution to this very deep problem, that's not just it's a capitalism problem, it's a care problem. How do you navigate the asset problem that we have in terms of intergenerational, agricultural capitalism?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, succession crises are not unique. They're not unique to co-ops. Like, it's one of the issues just in traditional farm country right now. That farmers are aging like hell, and people kind of don't know who or if anyone is going to come in behind them. This is, I think, one of the hardest problems to solve when it comes to like cooperative agriculture, because I don't think cooperative agriculture necessarily solves it. Cooperative agriculture is really more about distributing equity better and more equitable outcomes to farm workers and people who work higher up in the food value system, the food chain, getting equity to them better while they're working. But then we've got the issue of, right, like, what do we do when people retire? What do we do about people getting old, and what is the care issue? And the answer to that is, I don't know yet. There's even, there's even an argument to be made, like, if you talk about things like intentional communities or agrihoods and things like that, there's this long running problem of, should the business try to solve the social problem? And the question is, or can it really? One of our ideas is that if you have, excuse me, if you have an integrated farming collective that not only owns land, not only owns its own equipment, but also owns things like the processing plants, that owns the markets, that has all of these things that you can leverage money against. And as long as you don't have too many people retiring, say, at the same time, which is why I don't think you necessarily want to start a co-op with like a bunch of people who are the exact same age. Because like 40 years later, it's like, oh shit, like you might as well have one person that's getting ready to retire. But again, like, even like, I could see that solution working where like you're almost borrowing against your assets to maybe cash people out. And as long as you're operating at a margin where you can replace that at a rate that isn't lower than your burn rate, then you'll be okay. But even that, like, just thinking about that inside my head, like that feels like the capitalist Ponzi scheme. Like, you have to like keep growing and keep being profitable at a rate to like make up for people who cash out. So, I mean, the answer is, I don't know. It's almost like, I don't know. It's such a broad and deep problem between fixing the land sustainability problem, the water sustainability problem, the food sovereignty problem, the food production problem, the equity in farming problem, the racial justice problem, the justice for LGBTQIA type problem, and then on top of that, solving elder care and like end of life type things and legacy and things like that. Like, it's a hard problem to solve all at once, and I don't got it. I'm sorry if anybody today is like, I don't do like.
Well, thank you for joining us today.
Like, I'm all done. But no, it's like one of those things where it's like, stay tuned, because it is something we're thinking about. And it is, for example, probably the big critical issue that we've had with some of the models that we've seen coming out of the global South, where I think, frankly, they're doing better work than we are here up in the North. But when we have a culture that is so individualistic compared to the global South, for example, how can we make those models work here? How do you merge agriculture and agribusiness with instruments to maintain a society? Or is that something that has to be addressed separately? Because, for example, like, the whole thing of like, how do people retire? How do they keep from being destitute thing would go away if we friggin' get like universal basic income and free healthcare for everybody, like, any other sane friggin' country. But we don't do that here. And it is very possible that it's just too much to try to assume that agriculture or even impact agribusiness, like the time that we're pursuing, should necessarily be in the business of solving that problem.
Talk to me more, though, about the impact agribusiness part after the farm? Because there are a few questions that are about, all right, well, can impact agribusiness, for example, change what it is that people are eating to make it, to address the inequities, for example, in diseases related to the food system in BIPOC communities, for instance?
Yeah, so the beyond the farm part basically looks like what happens to the food after it leaves the farm gate. Instead of it going as, in raw commodity farm or like, pickled or canned or like basic processing, instead of that just going to a farmer's market, it goes into some kind of processing to make it either more shelf stable, like for example, taking your greens and freezing them and packing them so they actually retain their nutritive value beyond the farmer's market. It can also mean things like owning the processing plant, like owning the abattoir and the slaughterhouse that processes your beef and processes your pork, so that you're able to keep that money, because that's a lot of money. Like our butcher bill, like there's a reason that's a phrase. Like the butcher bill is high, and it eats the hell out of your margins. As a direct provider. So like owning that, owning the meat packer. It's like we kind of talked about. Are we going to talk about Joel Salatin? Let's talk about Joel Salatin for a minute.
And we're away.
We're going to talk about unlearning agriculture. I'm not even going to touch on like all the stuff that I've been kind of making him famous for about lately. But Michael Pollan's book has this kind of throwaway line that I think he should have made the whole book about. There's a throwaway line where Joel and this guy named Bev Eggleston, who I think is a farmer type person that is or was associated with Joel, they were sitting around and they were talking about their struggles. I think Bev's issue setting up a poultry processing plant, I think somewhere in the Virginia area, and how like the USDA suddenly pulled this inspector because he wasn't putting through enough volume or whatever. And Joel came back talking about, yeah, I know what you're talking about with the regulations and blah, blah, blah. Joel had just mortgaged his property in order to buy a controlling interest in a slaughterhouse in Central Virginia. And I kind of thought, and then he like kind of moved on. And and at the time when I first read the book, like I just moved right along with the author. But now going back, knowing what I do about agriculture, I'm like, wait. Dude mortgaged his farm to buy a slaughterhouse? Like, and just knowing how his business model works and knowing how central that processing facility is for him to do what he does. Because Joel makes a living writing books and giving seminars about how like if you lift yourself up by your bootstraps and work real hard and like pull your chickens every day and don't whine and complain and want what everybody else does, then you can be just like him. And like you can be a successful farmer and your kids will want to be successful farmers, blah, 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 blah. He doesn't tell you that he has a 550 acre freaking like property that he was able to mortgage for God knows how many millions of dollars to buy the middle of his supply chain. Like nobody talks about that shit. And what would Joel do without that? And like even getting out of like, so like that's where he processes his pork and his beef. And like that is how his business turns, like on that. On the other side, like on the poultry side of the operation, he attacks it the other way. He's got a bunch of free labor. Like he's got people he's paying probably around the equivalent of 25 to 30 cents an hour, basically to pull chickens to the field and then to kill chickens on the slaughter line. But again, like his profitability is not just in like selling boneless, skinless chicken breasts to white people who don't like seasoning. It's all about like owning that middle of the supply chain and being able to make it, and either being able to own it outright, like he does with T&E Meats, or on the other hand, to just make it as insanely cheap as possible with a combination of no government oversight, because he, like most farmers, including me, operate under a Virginia poultry exemption, and then not paying people. Like that's what it boils down to. So like, there's a non-exploitive way to do that. Like the part that he's done with T&E Meats, like I don't fault him for that at all. Like if I had 550 acres, like that's exactly what I'd do. The part about like making people work for like $100 a month and giving them Campylobacter and stuff, I wouldn't do that. But like our whole thing is instead of, getting to the point where we're processing 25,000 birds a year, and we're just going to like, instead of getting a USDA certified plant and going under inspection and all that, the traditional sustainable agriculture model is to, okay, have an apprentice start a farm over there and they'll be a contract farmer and they'll sell their stuff to you and you get around the regulations that way. So like that's one way to kind of integrate your middle, but our way is basically set up a poultry processing plant and, you know, make it available to other farmers in the area, mostly put your own product through it. Integrating the middle, you know, you can go beyond the middle, and we plan to go beyond the middle, like owning our markets, whether it's farmers markets, whether it's brick and mortar groceries in the city, whether it's food trucks, food carts, restaurants. You know, we basically want to own every place where that food goes through, basically right into the point where it goes into your gullet hole and into your stomach, because that's where all the profitability in the system is. The profitability is not designed to be at and before the farm gate. That's all about asset appreciation. That's all about taking advantage of government tax credit and various forms of farmer welfare to make sure that your land appreciates at a rate beyond whatever your farm might happen to lose in any one year. And in the meantime, just work as a cop to like pay for your groceries.
Well, God forbid. We're heading up on the hour, and there are so many questions from Ruba, Ben, Laurie, Garrett that we're not going to be able to get to. But there is one from the Regenerative Design Group that seems to bring us to a nice close, which is about where the money for all this comes from. You know, I mean, at the end of the day, how are, you know, if we are to imagine a transformation of the economy towards more cooperative ownership and control, and you know, perhaps even imagining what happens after ownership when you know, we imagine precisely the kinds of architecture of Medicare for all and you know, decent social security and dignity in education, healthcare, and all the rest of it. Where is the money going to come from, and are you looking? What kinds of finance do you imagine now and possibly in the future is going to get us to a way of? I mean, again, to start at the beginning, the story about the way that agriculture has been taught is really a story about finance and assets. And if we are to unlearn agriculture, we have to unlearn finance in some way. Can you maybe help us do that as the sort of capstone to our unlearning session today?
Yeah, what's not going to happen is like venture capital style Silicon Valley funding. That's not going to happen. You're not going to get the returns because fundamentally agriculture cannot return the kind of fast, like almost like highly aerobic kind of returns that these guys would usually expect. You're not going to get hockey stick type growth, not without hurting something. I think what's ultimately going to happen is that money is going to have to come from the government. I mean, we talked about this earlier. And I think what's so important for outfits like mine and for any others out there that are kind of playing around with new models of agriculture, collectivized agriculture, operating at scale. And I think scale is the important one for a really big reason, is that we need to demonstrate success so that it becomes politically palatable for politicians to start proposing funding things like this publicly. Because right now, like the best thing you're going to get is like that stuff that Cory Booker has out there about just like banning CAFOs with like no solution about what comes next, right? We need models like ours to use the types of impact capital that we've been able to raise both democratically and from certain deep-pocketed individuals who just want to see change in the world. But ultimately, I don't think we can necessarily rely systemically on raising the money the way I'm raising. I think ultimately the resources of the government has to get involved. I think ultimately we have to start redirecting our finances from war to peace, because fundamentally, you know, we've been a wartime economy since World War II. Like it's never stopped. Yeah, it never stopped. We've been at war like systematically all the time since World War II. You talk about this in your book as well. Like we're constantly at war because like you have to have one war after another to keep paying for capitalism basically. And that's kind of a situation we're in. And I think ultimately that cycle needs to be broken. And we have to, you know, I talk a lot about how a lot of people have a difficult time imagining an economy where public resources are directed toward peace instead of war. Because a lot of us just have never lived in that world, including me. You know, but where I'm lucky and where a lot of indigenous people especially are lucky is that we've heard of such a thing. That it does exist, that it can happen, that a society can deliberately turn back from that type of wartime economy. Because there's a reason why Daganowida and the Great Law of Peace came about. Like, you know, the Iroquois and the Six Nations and other nations that have done that, they were not in this Edenic state of like kumbaya forever. Like, no, these guys were like beating the hell out of each other until a few people said, this has to stop or we're all going to kill ourselves. So it's possible. And ultimately, I think the kind of financing that we need is going to have to come from public investment in a model that people have seen work. at a scale that matters, which is why, again, like the work we're trying to do, why we're pursuing scale, why we're doing this in the shadow of Washington, D.C. Like, we're an hour and a half from D.C. Like any senator, any congressman or their lackeys or aides or whatever can come down here and take a look at what we're doing. That's why it's really important to say, hey, look, we were able to raise $35 million, and we were able to save damn near the whole western shore of the Chesapeake watershed, and provide food for people, and provide food sovereignty, and get the price of food to the point where it's accessible, and feed people better diets and get better health outcomes, better agricultural outcomes. If they see that, that becomes politically palatable to start funding and start supporting with legislation, with regulation. And until we get that, we're just going to be stuck in this same old bullshit about saying that diet is going to fix everything. Go vegan, go plant-based, go keto, go regenerative. Cows are going to save the planet. Like, everybody thinking their individual choices or whatever is going to save the planet. It's not. So that's kind of what I think. Ultimately, the government does have to get involved, but there's a middle step.
Chris, thank you so much for that. Feels like a good place to end on it, but unless you've got more to share, which you always do, but do you have time?
I'm going to shut up. I don't want to put anybody to sleep.
Okay. Well, in that case, Chris, thank you so much for this conversation. I believe Lauren is coming here to close us out.
Wow. Thank you, everybody. Chris and Raj, that was incredible. I have never seen so many questions coming in. Sorry to everybody for not being able to answer that storm of questions, but Chris's Twitter feed, his Instagram, Medium, check that out. There's a lot of learning and unlearning to do. I mean, when we live in a food system that produces enough food, calories for over 10 billion people, yet over 1 billion still go to bed hungry, that equation doesn't work without injustice. And that's the reality. There's so much unlearning we have to do about our agricultural system. We talk about this every week with excellent examples from across the world. And Chris is just leading the way, challenging minds. I hope everybody had a little bit of uncomfort today. I hope everybody had some wake-up calls that they're going to spend this weekend thinking about, maybe next time they drive into a restaurant or McDonald's. Think about these real questions that were presented today. I'd love, before we close this out and introduce next week's broadcast topic, I'd love to give Raj and Chris an opportunity to say any closing thoughts, especially because with our Juneteenth broadcast, Chris, your closing thought was phenomenal, and I saw everybody loving that, praising that. So I'm excited for what's coming out today.
Oh, Jerry Springer final thought. I'm going to kind of go back to speaking to that group of people that are looking at, they want to get on the land, they want to do land-based enterprises, they want to start a farm. I know that a lot of what I said can maybe feel intimidating. It can maybe feel like I'm saying, don't do this. Don't lose your friggin' mind and do what I just did. Because I won't say that. But what I will say is this. If you're going to farm, if you want to farm, if you want to be a land protector or water protector and engage in food sovereignty and be a part of that solution, don't go alone. Don't go with a romantic partner. And don't make it a family thing. You need a team, just like you would any other business. In a lot of ways, land-based enterprises are treated too much like businesses in terms of they treat, the land, they treat people, they treat them as these fungible things that just eventually translate into money. You don't want to bring that aspect of business into it, but you do want to bring the aspect of, you need people who are good at the things that you need in order to succeed in farming. And that's going to be people who are good at land protection, land stewardship, people who are good at forestry, people who are good at growing food, growing plants, raising animals humanely. But you're also going to need people whose job is just to look after your finances. People whose job is just to be that slick salesman who makes sure that your product actually has somewhere to go besides rotting in your freezers or rotting in your coolers or whatever. So when you go into it, you should have 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people that are going in with you. and who are going to share that burden, and where you're not going to be alone and burning out and like having your marriage fall apart on you and having your kids not know who you are as this business grows. You don't want to do that. Farming is absolutely possible. The land is waiting for people to come back. But we want to go back the right way, and we want to make sure that we persist on that landscape. And the way you do that is by going together and not alone.
Thank you. That was awesome. Raj.
I got nothing. Because my mind is blown from learning from Chris. I mean, the idea that you can do food sovereignty alone is preposterous. You can't. There's no way. And food sovereignty is the kind of thing that has to happen through transformative change and a transformative understanding of what work is and how care happens and how power is distributed not just in the home but in community. And there are, I'm just at the beginning of a learning journey that's about understanding how indigenous people in the United States and around the world have always imagined that our relationship to the land might be different from the exploitative one that we have now. And I'm grateful for visionaries like Chris and the women and men and comrades behind him, as well as the histories of the people on whose occupied land I now stand, to teach me that. And I'm grateful for the opportunity in fora like these to be able to explore that much more deeply. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you. Wow. So Revolution might not be televised, but it will be open source. Let's collectivize this process and work together, y'all. Consider supporting Sylvanico Farms at their Venmo, PayPal. Follow everybody who is speaking today. Buy Raj's book. Buy all of Raj's books. Like just everyone. Go right now and buy them, please. And check out Food and Empire. That really lays the foundation. A lot of people have been asking on the chats, like, where do we get this information? I think that's a great entryway into Chris Newman's unbelievable mind. Like one of the first farmers I ever worked with, he said, farming isn't rocket science, but a rocket scientist couldn't do it. So there's some brilliance here. So tune in next Friday. We have the Maori Council of Grannies. This is incredible. We're going to be talking about a lot of indigenous issues over there. It's going to be unreal. Jane Ruka is a dearest friend of mine. So please come on in, guys. And we want to thank everybody who's been a part of this. Thank Raj and Chris. Thank our sponsors for supporting this. Please tune in every week, guys. Be part of this journey. Let's learn together and let's understand that not everything only happens in the United States. There's a lot going on all over the world and we must learn. So much of the United States is that rugged individualism, right? That mindset does not exist in a lot of the world. So let's learn. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Raj. Everybody tune in next week.